She boarded the plane with nothing but a book, a ticket, and quiet confidence. But moments later, a flight attendant told her she didn't belong and forced her to the back without asking a single question. What happens when a calm teenage girl sends one message and the entire flight is brought to a stop? If this happened to your daughter, what would you do? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters. Now let's begin the story that stopped a plane and started something bigger. The first thing you noticed was how still she was. Seat 3A. First class, window view, headphones resting gently around her neck, a paperback novel, untouched, sat quietly in her lap. And her eyes, gazing past the clouds, somewhere far beyond the sky. Ava Monroe didn't fidget, she didn't scroll, she didn't tap her foot, she just existed in silence. It was her first flight alone. The ticket, an award from a summer STEM program she'd completed with top honors. Her backpack carried more than books, it carried pride. And tucked inside its front pocket, wrapped in a handkerchief, was a tiny bronze compass, a gift from her grandmother, who once whispered, "You'll go far, baby. Just remember, you already belong." Ava wanted to believe that. But belief can be a fragile thing. The plush leather of the first-class seat felt too soft beneath her. The air smelled faintly of citrus and distance, and the silence around her wasn't the peaceful kind. The man in 3B glanced once, then again. The flight attendant smiled, polite, tight, measured. Someone across the aisle leaned forward just enough to be noticed, but not enough to be confronted. No one said a word, and yet she heard everything. It wasn't hate, it was hesitation, assumption, doubt dressed in silence, that maybe she didn't belong here. That maybe her seat was a mistake. That maybe her presence asked a question no one wanted to answer. She had earned this moment. Every late night building prototypes, every line of code, every missed weekend, every test she aced when no one was watching. And still, even pride feels fragile in the wrong room. The gentle murmur of the cabin continued. A lull of polite conversations, the soft hum of the engine, and the quiet anticipation of takeoff. Ava remained still in seat 3A. She had finally settled into a rhythm of breath, one that almost felt steady. She had even reached for her book, almost. Then came a voice, firm, flat, devoid of warmth. "Excuse me, where are your parents?" Ava looked up, blinking against the overhead light. The woman in front of her stood with military poise, dark blue blazer, silver name tag that read Clara Jenkins, lips pressed in a practiced line. There was no smile, no introduction, just the question, cold and clinical. Ava straightened herself in her seat. Her fingers found the ticket still tucked into the sleeve of her book. "I'm traveling alone," she said quietly, offering the ticket. "This is my seat." Clara glanced at the paper, but not for long. Her eyes returned quickly to Ava's face, then swept downward, slowly, over her hoodie, her backpack, her braids. "I need you to collect your things and move to the back," Clara said, already stepping aside as if it were decided. Ava blinked again, trying to understand. She checked her ticket, she looked at the seat number above her, then back at Clara. "This is 3A. It matches," she said, more softly now. Clara's voice didn't rise, but it got colder. "There's been a seating issue, please move, now." Ava opened her mouth, but nothing came. Not from her, not from anyone. The man beside her didn't turn. The woman across the aisle looked at the window as if the clouds outside had suddenly become urgent. A flight attendant, a few rows down, adjusted a cart and vanished behind the curtain. Nobody said her name. Nobody asked a question. Nobody moved. Ava's hand tightened around the strap of her backpack. She rose slowly, her shoulders square, her steps careful. Not hurried, not rebellious, just dignified. The aisle felt longer than it had when she boarded. Every step echoed against the thick carpet like a quiet accusation. She passed rows of faces that avoided hers, some shifting in their seats, some looking too busy, some pretending to sleep. No one stopped her. She moved past row 10, then 18, then 24. And as she walked, it no longer felt like moving seats. It felt like being erased. It wasn't a fall. It wasn't a shove. It was something smaller. Something quieter. And somehow it cut deeper. When she finally reached the very last row, Ava slid into the narrow seat by the lavatory. The smell of antiseptic lingered. The hum of the engines was louder here. She set down her bag, placed the untouched book back on her lap, and folded her hands. She looked forward, not to the front of the plane, but through it. And then, like a thought slipping through the cracks of resolve, one quiet line returned to her. Sometimes injustice doesn't scream. It whispers, and no one answers. The last row of the plane was cold. Not in temperature, but in feeling. It sat like an afterthought, tucked beside the lavatory, where the hum of the engines wasn't soothing, it was isolating. Ava folded into the window seat, smaller than she'd ever felt, surrounded by quiet, but not peace. She didn't cry, she didn't fidget, she just sat. Her backpack rested against her knees. She reached inside slowly and pulled out her phone. The screen lit up, and for a moment it was the only light that felt honest. She opened her messages and stared at the blank space, typed, then paused, deleted, typed again. Finally, she settled on one line. She said, "I didn't belong. I'm in the back now." She stared at the words, the weight of them, the hurt in them. Then she hit send. The message disappeared into the void, small, fragile, like tossing a pebble into a vast, still ocean. Ava exhaled. Her fingers hovered, then slid to the compass keychain clipped to her bag. A gift from her mother years ago. A reminder, she once said, to always know which way your spirit is pointing. She closed her eyes, and then, like a match struck in memory, her mother's voice returned. Clear, steady. From a quiet morning in their kitchen. Don't let silence swallow your worth. It had been after school. Ava was 10. She'd come home quiet, dragging her backpack like it weighed more than it should. A teacher had made a joke. Something about girls like her not needing to worry about engineering. It was just a joke, he said. But jokes, she learned, have sharp edges. Her mother didn't storm into the school. She didn't write a letter or make a scene. She simply handed Ava a sandwich, sat beside her at the kitchen table and said, "You don't have to shout to be heard, baby, but don't you dare let anyone quiet your light." Back in the plane, Ava opened her eyes. Her phone buzzed. A reply. "Send me the flight number." Short, direct, from Eleanor Reed. Ava's chest rose with a slow inhale. She typed the number, hesitated, then pressed send. Eleanor Reed wasn't family. Not by blood, but she was family in every way that counted. A mentor. A second mother. The kind of woman who walked into rooms like she owned the walls. Who had once told Ava, "When you feel small, find your ground, and then plant yourself like an oak." Eleanor had fought too many quiet battles to ignore this one. She wouldn't need context. She wouldn't need permission. And Ava knew, the moment that message landed, things were already in motion. She looked up. Nothing had changed. Passengers were still flipping through in-flight magazines. A child was asking for more apple juice. Clara Jenkins was still in the front, smiling that same tight smile, passing out warm towels that didn't warm anyone. But Ava felt it. Something had shifted, like the moment before a storm. The air felt thick, charged. Not everyone could sense it, but she could. Because when you live in a world that tries to erase you quietly, you learn to hear the moment something begins to push back. And this time, it had started with her. The plane had just begun to roll. A low hum vibrated beneath the cabin floor. Wheels eased forward. Seatbelt signs blinked. The flight attendants moved with practiced grace, checking latches, securing trays. Clara Jenkins stood near the front galley, clipboard in hand. Her posture was perfect, her uniform pristine, but her fingers fidgeted ever so slightly against the edge of the leather binding. She'd done her part, handled the seating discrepancy, kept control. Or so she thought. Then came the voice, crackling through the cockpit speaker. Not meant for passengers, but just audible enough in the front. "Captain Hayes, FAA operations, hold the flight. We're issuing a priority delay for immediate ground review. Do not depart." The hum beneath the passengers' feet stopped. The slow glide of the plane came to a halt. Subtle, quiet, but final. The entire aircraft seemed to inhale and hold its breath. Captain Hayes leaned forward in his seat, eyes narrowing. "FAA? On what grounds?" The response was clipped. "Information classified. Stand by for further instructions. Do not proceed with takeoff." In row 2, a man turned to his wife. "What's going on?" A few rows back, someone said, "Is it weather?" Another muttered, "It's probably mechanical." But no warning lights blinked. No announcements were made. Clara's jaw tightened. She turned away from the galley, smoothing the front of her blazer. She walked down the aisle slowly, checking overhead bins that didn't need checking. Her steps were measured, her expression collected. But her eyes betrayed her. Luis, seated in row 4, caught it. He watched her too long. Watched the way her hand lingered just a little too long on the back of a seat. The way she glanced toward the cockpit, not once but twice. Louis had noticed her earlier, not when she asked the girl to move. No, he'd been reading then, looking away like everyone else. But now, something was off. The air inside the cabin felt different. Not just paused, but suspended, like a chord held too long in a song, like something unspoken waiting to fall. Louis shifted in his seat. He thought of his daughter, 8 years old, full of questions, always watching. He pictured her asking, "Dad, why didn't you say anything?" And suddenly the silence felt heavier. Across the plane, whispers had begun to rise. "Why aren't we moving? Is there a delay? Did someone get sick?" Clara kept moving, but her steps were shorter now. In the back, Ava sat still. She hadn't moved, but she felt everything. She watched the flight attendants exchange looks, the way the pilot peeked out of the cockpit then ducked back in. And though no one had said her name, she knew something had shifted. Not in anger, not in noise, but in stillness. The plane didn't move. But beneath the surface, beneath the skin of this polished aircraft, something was rumbling. The kind of rumble that doesn't come from engines, but from consequence. The cabin was still, but not the kind of stillness that comes with calm. This was the kind that settles after something has shifted. The kind that makes people glance sideways and pretend not to notice their own discomfort. Louis sat in seat 4C, elbows resting on the armrests, his fingers lightly tapping against his knee. He didn't usually pay attention to flight staff. He'd been flying for years, routine, mindless. But this wasn't routine. He'd heard the pilot's voice. He saw the flight suddenly stall. He noticed how Clara Jenkins, the poised, polished lead attendant, kept circling the cabin, glancing toward the cockpit with something brittle in her eyes. And then there was the girl. She was still in the back, still quiet, still holding the same seat she'd been forced into, far from where she first sat. Louis looked toward Clara as she passed near his row again. He stood up, not abruptly, but with intention. "Excuse me," he said. Clara stopped, adjusted the clipboard in her hands, and met his gaze. Louis's tone was even, but there was something in it, measured, sharp beneath the calm. "Why did you only question her?" Clara blinked. "I'm sorry? You asked that girl to move," he continued. "But you didn't ask anyone else in that cabin where they were supposed to be." Clara hesitated. Her grip on the clipboard tightened. "It was instinct," she said, voice clipped. Louis tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Instinct," he echoed, "or assumption?" Clara didn't answer. She gave a small nod, polite, dismissive, and turned to walk away. But Louis wasn't done. "I have a daughter," he said, his voice a little louder now. "She's 12, she's black, and she flies with me all the time." Clara paused in her steps. "She was adopted when she was 4, Louis added, more to himself now. "I tell her every day she belongs wherever she walks." His eyes drifted toward the back. "I wonder what she'd think if she saw this." There was a rustle 2 rows behind him. An older man, gray-haired, face weathered like worn leather, leaned forward slightly. "I saw it too," he said, voice soft but clear. "I watched her ask that girl to move, and I looked away." He let the words sit for a second, then added, "That's on me." Nobody responded. But something changed. A passenger lowered his newspaper. A woman across the aisle reached for her armrest, fingers trembling slightly. A young man pulled out one of his earbuds, no longer pretending to watch his movie. Louis sat down slowly, his hands suddenly heavier. He remembered a moment from 2 years ago. His daughter had come home from school, silent, holding a crumpled drawing in her hand. She said nothing at first, just laid it on the table. It was a self-portrait, but her skin had been colored pale peach. When he asked why, she shrugged and said, "Maybe then people won't ask if I'm lost so much." That moment had shattered him. He'd promised himself he'd do better, speak up more. And yet, he had stayed silent, again. Now, the silence around him wasn't just uncomfortable, it was charged. The air felt full, like it was holding a collective breath. He could hear soft voices now. A young mother whispering to her son, who asked too loudly, "Why was that girl in the back?" "I don't know," the mother answered, her voice cracking. But it wasn't right. A man in business attire pulled his briefcase closer and cleared his throat, as if preparing to say something, but deciding not to. Not yet. Still, the energy was shifting. Across the cabin, the silence had become active. It was no longer polite. It was no longer detached. It was watching, listening, reckoning. Clara stood at the front, shoulders stiff. She knew they were watching her now. But Ava didn't turn around. She didn't need to. Because something had broken through. Not loudly, not with outrage, but with truth. Small, steady, unstoppable. A murmur of awareness began to rise, unspoken but unmistakable. They had seen, and now they couldn't unsee. The knock came gently, not rushed, not demanding, just respectful. Ava looked up from her seat in the last row. A uniformed attendant stood beside her, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "The captain would like to speak with you. We've arranged a space up front where you can wait while things are clarified." Ava didn't respond right away. She gathered her bag slowly, still clutching the paperback book she hadn't opened. And then she stood. No one clapped, no one gasped. But the cabin felt different as she walked forward. This time not pushed, not exiled, just invited. Each row she passed held a new weight. Not the shame she'd carried walking away earlier. This was something else. A recognition, an awareness. Some lowered their eyes. Some met hers, briefly, with something like regret. And one woman gave a barely there nod, subtle but sincere. When Ava reached the front, a crew member opened the curtain, guiding her into a small private area near the cockpit, normally reserved for resting pilots or high-ranking staff. There was a seat, a bottle of water, and quiet. Ava sat down slowly, placing her bag beside her. She looked at the walls, not lavish, but cleaner, calmer. For a moment, she just breathed. In the cabin behind her, a young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom," she whispered. "Why did they treat her like that?" The mother froze. Her lips parted, then closed. She reached for her daughter's hand, squeezed it gently. I don't know, baby," she whispered back, barely audible. "But it was wrong." The girl nodded, her face thoughtful. And for the rest of the flight, she held her mother's hand a little tighter. In the private space, Ava leaned back in her chair. Her eyes drifted shut, not from exhaustion, but from memory. She was 13 again. Standing in Eleanor Reed's office for the first time. Ava had just won her middle school's robotics competition, but a teacher accused her of plagiarism. "No way a girl like you built this," he'd said. She hadn't cried. Not until she sat across from Eleanor, who reviewed the blueprints in silence, then looked up with calm, piercing eyes. "You don't have to prove anything to those who never wanted to believe in the first place," Eleanor said. "Strength doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it just has to be still." Ava had memorized those words, carried them like a shield. And now here she was again, quiet, composed, and entirely unwilling to shrink. She didn't ask for an apology. She didn't demand an audience. She simply sat, present, unmoved, undiminished. Behind her, the plane remained grounded. But something deeper was beginning to lift. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't about shaming someone or proving a point. It was about reclaiming space, gracefully, reasserting humanity without begging for it. Ava didn't need the captain to say sorry. She didn't need the passengers to make speeches. What she needed, what she had always needed, was for the world to pause long enough to see her. And now, for the first time that day, it had. She reached into her bag, unwrapped the handkerchief, and pulled out the bronze compass her grandmother had given her. She ran her thumb along the edge. The needle settled, pointing north, still steady, still sure. The doors slid open with a quiet hiss. Eleanor Reed stepped into the terminal, not with urgency but with intention. There was no need for introductions. People moved aside without realizing why. Dressed in slate gray, heels precise, gaze steady, Eleanor didn't demand attention. She simply commanded space. She moved through the security area with a courtesy nod from the lead officer. Her clearance was pre-approved. Her name opened doors. But it wasn't her title that made people pause. It was her presence. Inside the private lounge near the front of the aircraft, Clara Jenkins waited, back straight, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. When the door opened, she stood, automatically. "Miss Reed," she said, voice taut. Eleanor offered a small nod, stepping in without pause. She placed her bag gently on the table and sat, calm, collected, then looked directly at Clara. "You didn't just question her seat," she said, voice low but unwavering. "You questioned her presence." Clara's breath caught. She began, then stopped. Eleanor didn't blink. She didn't need to raise her voice. The room had already shrunk to just the two of them. Clara looked down. Her voice, when it returned, was small, strained. "I once made a mistake," she said. "Years ago, I trusted a young passenger, gave him clearance he hadn't earned." She swallowed. "He brought something on board he shouldn't have. It triggered an alert. Cost us hours in lockdown, a full investigation. I was nearly dismissed. Her voice cracked. Since then, I double-check, triple-check, especially when they're young. Especially when they... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. Not aggressively, just enough. So you punished this girl for someone else's mistake. Clara's face tightened. No, I followed instinct. Protocol. Eleanor raised a hand gently. It wasn't a command, it was clarity. No, Miss Jenkins, you followed fear, and you cloaked it in policy. Silence fell between them like a dropped curtain. Clara sat back slowly. Her eyes darted toward the window, the door, anywhere but the woman in front of her. I didn't mean for it to escalate, she murmured. Eleanor's tone softened, but it didn't lose strength. I believe that. She paused. Let the words settle. But impact outweighs intent. Clara nodded faintly. Her walls were cracking now. I thought I was protecting the flight, she said. After that incident, I lost trust. In myself, in judgment, and maybe I began to look for threats where there weren't any. She looked up, eyes glassy but steady, and maybe, especially when they looked like her. That truth hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor didn't flinch. She let it sit, ugly, honest, human. Then she spoke, softly, firmly. Fear doesn't justify bias. Accountability does. Clara exhaled, a tremor in her breath. I don't expect forgiveness. Eleanor stood, gathering her bag. This isn't about forgiveness. It's about repair. She walked to the door, then turned back for one final glance. Dignity isn't restored by apology. It's restored by change. Start there. And with that, she was gone. Clara sat alone in the silence, the echo of her own choices pressing into her like weight. No one had shouted. No one had slammed a fist. But the truth had arrived, and it hadn't needed a loud entrance. The headlines hit the internet before the plane even touched down. Teen girl removed from first class, FAA intervenes mid-flight. Grounded by bias, airline under fire after passenger demotion. She was quiet, but her message made the sky stop. By noon, the story was everywhere. News anchors leaned into the camera with furrowed brows. Experts were brought in to discuss implicit bias in the airline industry. Clips from previous viral incidents resurfaced. Comment sections exploded. And in a glass conference room on the top floor of the airline's headquarters, a dozen executives sat in stiff silence. The CEO stood at the head of the table. He hadn't touched his coffee. His tie was loosened, his patience threadbare. He tapped the edge of the table once, twice, before speaking. I don't want a press release, he said flatly. I want a plan. A murmur passed through the room. Someone cleared their throat. Another shuffled their notes. The FAA is opening a formal inquiry, one executive offered. They've requested all internal documentation from the flight, including cabin recordings, staffing logs, and complaint history. The CEO nodded. And the media? They're asking for statements. We're being tagged in thousands of posts. Systemic bias in the skies is trending globally. He exhaled through his nose. The head of operations leaned forward. We could issue a statement, express regret, emphasize commitment to equality. Words aren't the problem, the CEO interrupted. Perception is. He looked around the room. We built our brand on reliability and respect. Right now, we have neither. A woman from HR raised her hand. We've had training protocols in place for years, but it's surface level, check the box stuff. People sit through a slideshow and go back to work unchanged. A pause. Then she added, almost reluctantly, maybe it's time we stop treating bias as a public relations risk and start treating it as an operational failure. That landed. The room went still. Finally, a soft voice broke through from the far end of the table. I saw the footage, said a board member. Elderly, measured. The girl didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply moved. He looked up. And that was the problem. She didn't have to cause a scene for it to be a scandal. The injustice was quiet, but we all heard it. The CEO nodded slowly, then turned to his assistant. Call an emergency session with training and compliance. We're rewriting crew protocols. All flight attendants and senior staff will undergo intensive, recurring bias training. Real training, not a slideshow. He looked at legal. Add a new clause to our complaint process. Passengers can now escalate bias concerns directly to an external ombudsman. No more internal filtering. From the PR director, should we draft a public apology? But before the CEO could respond, the board member spoke again. Firmer this time. We don't need a press release. All eyes turned. We need reform. And that was it. The conversation shifted from image control to structural change. It wasn't flashy. There were no viral hashtags in that room, no slogans, but something real had been set in motion. Because when a system stops long enough to examine itself, really examine itself, it can either collapse or begin to rebuild. And this time, rebuilding had begun. The terminal was quieter this time. Or maybe it was Ava who had changed. She moved through security with calm precision. No hesitation in her steps. No second guessing of her presence. Gate B12 lit softly ahead, her connecting flight rebooked and ready. She walked past the newsstand, past the rows of blinking flight boards. Her backpack bounced gently with each step. And then, just before the final corridor, she saw her. Eleanor Reed stood waiting by the wide terminal window. No clipboard, no badge, no entourage. Just her. Tall, poised, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Ava approached slowly. Eleanor didn't move forward. She let the girl come to her, because this moment belonged to Ava, and Eleanor knew it. "You want to talk about it?" she asked gently. Ava looked out at the runway. The sky was pale blue, empty, wide. "Not yet," she said. Then she turned to Eleanor, eyes clear. "I think they heard me." No bitterness, no bravado, just quiet truth. Eleanor nodded once, like she'd been waiting for that answer all along. They stood together for a few seconds, watching a plane take off in the distance, its shadows stretching across the glass. Then came the boarding call. Ava turned. Eleanor didn't follow. She simply said, "Go well," and watched her walk away. The boarding tunnels stretched ahead. Flight attendants greeted passengers with routine smiles. No one stopped Ava this time. No one questioned. No one hesitated. She walked through the narrow bridge with her back straight, not proud in the way people imagine, not defiant, just grounded. At the base of the aircraft steps, the sun hit the aluminum frame just right, gleaming, soft, almost welcoming. Ava paused at the first step. She glanced up, not to search for judgment, but to feel the sky. Then she climbed, one step. Then another, no flinch, no sideways glance, just forward. Passengers around her filed in, finding their places. The flight crew offered water and boarding instructions. Ava sat by the window again. Different plane, different row, same girl, but not quite. She leaned her head back, closed her eyes briefly, and smiled. Not because everything was fixed, not because justice had fully arrived, but because she knew she'd taken her place, and this time, the world had noticed. Outside the window, the ground crew signaled, engines whirred to life, and as the aircraft began its taxi, a voice rose, quiet, warm, steady. She didn't ask for attention. She asked for respect. And now the sky is finally open to her, and to all who come after. If Ava's story spoke to you, please like, share, and subscribe to Mr. Mac Stories. We're here to tell quiet stories that carry truth, dignity, and change. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful content, not for noise, but for impact. Thank you for being part of this journey. And remember, you don't have to shout to be heard.